Environmental conditions at the Vieira compound were oppressive, a Chicago heat wave mirroring the subject's gilded confinement. The subject, a 22-year-old female, exhibited signs of psychosomatic distress as auditory stimuli from an adjacent room initiated a pivotal cognitive shift.
People think betrayal is the most painful part of a story like this. It's not. The real pain is that he already loves her and still chooses to wound her first just to protect himself. And she hears every brutal word, then walks down the aisle anyway, like her heart wasn't just shattered in the hallway. The cruelest twist of all is that the moment she's in danger, he's the one who breaks first. One of them pretends not to care. The other pretends not to hurt. And the whole story becomes a disaster where both sides lose, until almost losing each other becomes the only truth left.
The subject's eavesdropping was incidental, a result of disoriented navigation within the opulent structure. The voice of her spouse, Elio, acted as an abrupt anchor with the statement, "I don't want her, I never have," which induced a trauma response manifesting as physical recoil. The subject's perception of her bridal adornments shifted, processing them as oppressive symbols. A subordinate, Bruno, queried the rationale for the union, which was clarified as a commercial acquisition for control of her father's Southside docks, a purely strategic transaction. Despite his physical absence, the subject visualized Elio, age 37, with a rigid facial structure. Her memory recalled his prior assessments, characterized by detached gray eyes and an affect consistent with evaluating a financial asset. Elio articulated the strategic imperatives, neutralizing the Santoro family and annexing her father's ports. This data point is juxtaposed with a prior event where her father, Victoria Moretti, dismissed her artistic ambitions. Her aspiration for a conventional existence was deemed irrelevant. She was the transactional component. A cousin, Dario, whose gaze she processed as invasive, remarked on her aesthetic value for procreation, reducing her role to a biological function. The subject induced minor oral trauma to suppress a confrontational impulse, a reaction to being categorized as a reproductive vessel. Her behavior was constrained by ingrained cultural indoctrination, dictating a passive, ornamental role for females. Elio dismissed aesthetics, voicing a preference for a partner acclimated to their environment over a naive subject. This assessment reveals a significant misinterpretation of her character, whom he perceived as unsophisticated. The subject's history includes observing her mother's psychological deterioration within the same lifestyle. Her own long-term escape plans were subverted by her transfer to a male figure perceived as more threatening than her sire. Bruno inquired about post-ceremonial logistics. Elio dictated spatial segregation to the East Wing, contingent on non-interference and the production of a male heir. This detached disposition of her future served as the catalyst for an internal fracture. The psychological rupture was not romantic in nature, but an assault on her pride. Dario's jest prompted a display of affection, which Elio dismissed with the clinical statement, "I'll handle my responsibilities," codifying his functional approach. The subject did not remain for further stimuli and initiated a flight response. After isolating herself in a lavatory, she engaged in mirror gazing to confront her psychological state, the sound of her heels associated with gunfire. Her reflection induced a state of depersonalization. Her cosmetic facade concealed a vacant expression. She cognitively recategorized her identity as a pawn and treaty component before an external stimulus occurred via her phone. The communication was from Lena, her primary confidant. The message's casual inquiry about her well-being was jarring to the subject, whose trembling fingers responded with a request for 5 additional minutes. The subject engaged in escapist ideation, which was disrupted by a sharp auditory stimulus at the door. The voice of her father, Victoria Moretti, followed, exhibiting audible impatience. He questioned her delay, citing the ceremony's imminent start. The subject composed her features before revealing herself to Victoria Moretti, whose physical appearance suggested alcohol intake. He noted her pallor with focused observation. In response to his inquiry, she offered a fabricated explanation of anxiety. She reasoned that disclosing her spouse's contempt would be futile, as her father prioritized strategic gain. He summarily dismissed her stated nervousness. Lacking alternatives, she complied with his physical directive. His assertion that she should feel lucky registered as a caustic falsehood. Proceeding toward 200 guests, she noted armed security at all exits, a forecast of her confinement. The environment featured opulent displays and superficial social posturing. Male attendees engaged in clandestine dealings. The subject cognitively framed this milieu as her enclosure before the chapel doors were opened. Her procession commanded the assembly's attention. The subject maintained a rigid posture, a manifestation of social conditioning that overrode a significant flight impulse. At the altar awaited Elio Vieira, a physically imposing figure. His grooming was immaculate, his expression inscrutable. Upon making eye contact, she scanned his gaze for contradictory data but found only confirmation of his detached state. Subsequently, the subject entered a dissociative haze. She registered her own voice, reciting vows she perceived as toxic, and felt the cold, tactile sensation in the ring. The ritual kiss was processed as a transactional closure, and all surrounding stimuli were perceived as components of a deception. A persistent somatic sensation of cold radiated from her torso. At the reception, she performed social duties to a point of muscular fatigue, engaging with partners she failed to cognitively encode, and accepting praise from ambivalent females. Attendees possessed a collective understanding of the transaction's terms. Elio demonstrated minimal attention, prioritizing business affairs. She was treated as a finalized acquisition, presented intermittently for inspection by key individuals. His physical contact was proprietary, his smile a discordant, cold facade. His verbal introduction was delivered as a stiff, formal identifier. At approximately midnight, her confidant Lena located her in a state of passive observation. Lena assessed her condition as wrecked and provided her with a potent alcoholic beverage. The subject confirmed this assessment, as the relationship with her confidant did not require pretense. The two shared a lifelong bond. Perceiving atypical distress, Lena prompted for details. Geneva provided a full account of the overheard conversation, which elicited a strong anger response from her friend. Lena proposed leveraging commercial power to retaliate against Elio. Geneva exhibited an acute fear response, predicting that any financial loss would result in punitive action against her. Lena then questioned her acceptance of this role. The subject assessed her options as non-existent. Divorce or flight were deemed lethal threats. Concluding her fate was immutable, she adopted a mindset of endurance. Lena verbalized a dissenting view of the subject's potential. Lena expressed a desire for a normative pairing for her friend. The subject, acknowledging this was an impossibility, consumed the alcohol. She attempted to reframe the arrangement by focusing on security, a rationalization she knew was insufficient. The evening concluded with a ritualistic escort to the master suite, accompanied by relatives vocalizing crude expectations of procreation. The subject maintained a rigid, masked expression. The closing door marked the start of a private confrontation. Elio immediately consumed 2 servings of scotch. He then presented an option for her to occupy a separate room, his tone betraying a preference for this. The subject understood this as the baseline for their cohabitation agreement. The subject recognized this as the codification of her status as property. She deliberated a retreat to preserve dignity, but a recollection of his mischaracterization of her as naive triggered a strong oppositional response. She verbally refused to leave, referencing his stated requirement for an heir. This elicited a micro-expression of acknowledgement from him. He confirmed her eavesdropping, and she confirmed its extent before turning to disrobe. She vocalized the content she had overheard, including her status as unwanted and his perception of her as a naive outsider. A mechanical failure with her gown zipper induced a strong frustration response until he intervened with assistance. "That verbalization was not intended for you," he stated. Nevertheless, the data was received. Upon the material's failure, she recoiled, using the dress as a defensive barrier. "Let us abandon all artifice. This is a transaction, a strategic pact." She retreated to the bathroom, the distinct sound of the lock preceding her collapse against the door, yielding to an emotional release. For 90 days, Elio and I enacted a precise protocol of estrangement connected only by legal documentation. His operational sphere was the West Wing, mine was the East. Our trajectories did not intersect at meals. We appeared jointly only out of strategic necessity, and our verbal exchanges were marked by a clinical disinterest. The evening of our union was a sterile procedure, as he had described, devoid of any effective warmth. His actions were efficient, detached, and he has initiated no physical contact since. I rationalized this as inconsequential. I framed the emotional chasm between us as my preference for autonomy, not his rejection. My life of social functions and gallery events was, by my own assertion, sufficient. This was a carefully constructed fiction, and I was aware of its falsity. Yet the narrative served as an anesthetic for the acute distress I felt witnessing his effortless command of a room. It was a simpler construct than admitting that for 3 months I had been gathering observational data about him, the way a rare smile reconfigured his features, the calculated economy of his movements, the transient vulnerability in his gaze during unguarded moments. I was developing an attachment to a man with no reciprocal feeling, a contemptible pathology. As the September chill settled over Chicago, the aide, Bruno, began to appear in my wing with greater frequency. "Mrs. Vieira" was his constant greeting, the formality a persistent buffer against my request to be called Geneva. "The principal awaits your decision for the gala," or "The principal has approved the solarium redesign," or "The principal noted your isolation outdoors and has ordered additional security." The subject was always the principal. Never Elio. It required a full fortnight for this reality to breach my denial. I was the subject of continuous monitoring. Elio had me under perpetual surveillance. The scope extended beyond Bruno, encompassing covert cameras, shadowing bodyguards, and staff who logged my every action. Logically, this discovery should have provoked rage. In its place, a grim irony manifested. The man who professed total disinterest tracked my movements like a high-value asset. "What is the nature of this fixation on my activities?" I finally asked Bruno. His expression was a model of learned neutrality. "The principal executes his duties with extreme gravity, ma'am." "And which duty is that? My security or my availability?" The acidity in my tone was palpable. "For whenever he elects to procure the air he obsesses over." Something altered in Bruno's expression. "Mrs. Vieira, may I speak with candor?" My interest was piqued. I nodded for him to continue. "The principal is a man of significant complexity," Bruno began, his words chosen with care. "But he is not the individual you perceive him to be." My device vibrated before I could probe further, Lena confirming our meeting. The chosen restaurant was neutral ground, an establishment with no factional allegiances. Lena was already seated when I entered, her security detail observing the room from a nearby table with practiced vigilance. "You present as exhausted," she remarked as I sat. "Are you achieving restful sleep?" "Hardly." The bed had become a barren, expansive territory, mocking the solace I should have found in his absence. "So he continues to maintain a distance." I offered a simple nod. using the menu to obscure my face. Absolute silence, except when a decorative spouse is required for a photograph. Men are irrational, Lena noted, signaling a waiter. Ours especially. They view emotion as a liability. This is not about emotion, I replied. He simply has no desire for me. He made that point unequivocally before the wedding. After wine was served, Lena leaned forward, her voice lowered. Am I permitted to share intelligence my father has received? I assented, though a part of me felt a sense of dread. The Santoro family is making strategic moves, she said quietly, acquiring politicians, compromising police, reinforcing their control of the North Side. My father's assessment is that they are preparing for conflict. The Santoros, our adversaries, the entire strategic purpose of my union with Elio. Their territory was contiguous with ours, a fragile truce held for years, a volatile situation ripe for ignition. And how does that involve me? I asked, a cold anxiety constricting within me. You are perceived as his critical vulnerability, Lena stated bluntly. The one asset he values above his entire operation to harm you is to attack him. That is illogical. I hold no value for him. Are you certain? Lena's expression was dubious. My father states Elio has been fixated on your security from the outset. He tripled your security detail, installed a new surveillance grid, and gives personal clearance for anyone who comes within 50 feet of you. My earlier exchange with Bruno suddenly synthesized with alarming clarity. His duties are executed with extreme gravity. He's protecting a capital investment, I argued. An assault on his wife projects weakness. Continue with that narrative if it provides comfort, Lena answered, her face conveying her disagreement. Perhaps it is time you observed his behavior, not his statements. We spent the rest of the meal on safer topics, upcoming social events, and Lena's most recent dispute with her father about another suitor. We departed as the afternoon sun cast a warm light across the Chicago skyline. Marcus was waiting by the sedan. As we merged into traffic, I registered a black SUV behind us that was previously absent. Marcus, I said softly, feeling the initial surge of adrenaline. Are we under surveillance? His eyes flicked the mirror, his jaw set. Affirmative, hold on. He accelerated sharply, maneuvering through traffic with practiced skill. Yet the SUV adhered to our path, perfectly replicating each turn. Then the device in my hand activated. Elio's name appeared on the screen. Report your location, he ordered, his voice sharp with strain. We just left lunch. Marcus identifies a tail. I know. We have your position. Do not disconnect. For the first time, I detected a raw quality in his voice. It resembled fear. Elio, just maintain this line with me, Geneva. To hear him use my name, not a title, caused a suspension of my breathing. Bruno is 2 minutes away with support. Marcus has the protocol. At that moment, the SUV lunged forward, coming parallel to our vehicle. Through the darkened window, I saw the gleam of metal. Marcus wrenched the steering wheel, forcing us into an alley as gunfire erupted behind us. I cried out as the phone dropped from my hand, my fingers gripping the seat as Marcus drove on. Mrs. Vieira, Elio's voice called faintly from the floor. Geneva. My hands trembled as I reached for the phone. I'm here. I'm fine. What are your coordinates? I cannot determine them. The scenery outside was an incoherent blur. We are in the warehouse district. A subsequent volley of shots, this time deafeningly near. The rear window shattered, showering me with glass. I dropped to the floor, my pulse thudding in my ears. Just hold on, Marcus said through clenched teeth. Almost there. Where? Then I recognized it. One of Elio's holdings. It was a featureless structure, a fortress concealed as a warehouse. As we approached, massive gates retracted to admit us. Marcus drove through the gap just as it began to close. The pursuit terminated with the jarring sound of metal striking the gate as armed guards emerged from the gloom securing our car. Then Elio was there, wrenching my door open. His complexion was ashen, and unfiltered terror was evident in his eyes. "Are you injured?" His hands moved over me in a frantic assessment that destroyed his composed facade. "Are you shot? Geneva, speak to me. I am not hurt." The glass shattered, but I am unharmed, I was able to articulate, my own intense shaking thinning my voice. He pulled me from the car into an embrace so fierce it impeded my breath. I felt his heart beating rapidly against mine. He was trembling. Thank God. The words were a prayer spoken into my hair. When the tracker deviated from its course, he did not need to complete the statement. I understood. For the first time, a fissure had appeared in the armor of Elio Vieira. This was not the dispassionate oligarch. This was a man terrified at the prospect of losing me. The safe house was precisely what one would anticipate from Elio Vieira, a fortified, opulent sanctuary entirely off-grid. Large panels of ballistic glass overlooked the Chicago River, illuminating marble floors where silent sentinels monitored every point of entry. Its security systems were comparable to a federal facility's. This was merely another luxurious cage, like his primary estate, except now the formidable Elio was confined inside it with me. "You will remain here until the threat is neutralized," he stated, pacing like a captive predator, his sleeves rolled up his forearms. His usually ordered hair was disheveled where he had anxiously raked his hand through it. "Bruno is preparing our response. The Santoro family will be held accountable for this." I simply observed him from the couch, a tremor persisting in my body. This was not the man I had married. This Elio was beginning to unravel. "How long?" I whispered. "As long as is required." He stopped, his gray eyes locking with mine. "Days, weeks, until I am 100% confident you are no longer in danger." "So I am again your prisoner." A muscle twitched in his jaw. "You are being protected. There is a significant distinction." A dangerous light entered his eyes as he moved to the bar, pouring a scotch for himself and one for me. He pressed the tumbler into her hand, a firm, directive gesture. "Drink," he instructed, his tone clinical. "The tremors are pronounced." The observation was accurate. Her hands shook with such severity that the amber fluid breached the vessel's rim. The catecholamine surge was subsiding, replaced by the sickening somatic aftermath of a near-lethal event. "They discharged firearms at me," she verbalized, "with live ammunition." Acknowledged. Elio occupied the space beside her, a proximity absent since their union. His cologne and the tense line of his jaw were perceptible. "This failure is mine." Her astonishment was evident. "You claim fault?" "I failed to anticipate this," he articulated, his voice harsh as his hands clenched. "The Santoros have been testing our boundaries for months." His admission of culpability transmutes into a compulsive need for control, heightened security, which she immediately rejects as a further restriction of her liberty. She asserts her autonomy against his proprietary instinct, a position he is unable to contest as his vocal confidence diminishes under the burden of his perceived inadequacy. He leverages the designation wife as his rationale, a term rendered functionally meaningless by 3 months of strategic detachment. Her incisive question exposes his hypocrisy, reframing his prior emotional distance as evidence she was never a partner, but a calculated component in his grand strategy. His state of shocked immobility indicates her verbal assault has found its mark. Disinhibited by alcohol, she discloses the primary source of her psychological injury, an auditory memory from their wedding. She recounts his dialogue with Bruno and Dario, in which he classified her not as his bride, but as a quantifiable asset. The vascular constriction in his face serves as a somatic confirmation of her account. She maintains eye contact, her own distress fully displayed, and recontextualizes his current anxiety as the mere protection of an investment. The accusation lands, forcing him into a physical retreat from the confrontation, his posture rigid with unresolved internal conflict. A profound silence expands between them, ultimately broken by his proposal to disclose his underlying motivations. The emergent vulnerability in his tone elicits a guarded response from her. When he finally rotates to meet her gaze, the raw affect he displays is a significant deviation from his baseline stoicism. The meticulously constructed facade of detachment fractures, exposing unadulterated agony. His confession marks a stunning inversion of his dominant persona. He was in a state of terror, not of a rival organization, but of her, from the moment their union was proposed, a reality she struggles to integrate. Moving closer, he clarifies that his fear originated from the effective response she triggered in him. For 15 years, he had operated under the belief that emotion was a liability, erecting significant psychological defenses. She, however, represented an acute vulnerability, having bypassed these hardened barriers with ease. He admits to an abrupt and potent desire for her that transcended the physical. He confesses to a longing for psychological intimacy, to access her thoughts, to hear her laughter, a craving fundamentally incompatible with the transactional nature of their arranged marriage. She interprets his past conduct as a preemptive maneuver to establish dominance. He refutes this, classifying it not as an offensive, but as a defensive action, a protective instinct that ultimately caused mutual harm. He then reveals the profound psychic cost of his emotional withdrawal over the last 3 months. He describes the daily torment of maintaining proximity to her while knowing he was the agent of their contaminated start. She grapples with the severe irony of his disclosure. His cruelty was a byproduct of an overwhelming, unmanageable desire for her. He diagnoses his own behavior as cowardice. He prioritized fear over candor, a decision that led to her near-fatal encounter. This verbal admission is followed by an act of profound submission as he kneels, a dominant male deconstructed, and begins to recount the day's traumatic events. The percussive sound of gunfire had functioned as a violent, clarifying stimulus for his entire worldview. He pledges to dismantle his entire enterprise, to annihilate the Santoros and all adversaries, if it ensures her safety. He seizes her hands, silencing her objection to complete his declarative oath. He explicitly repudiates the transactional descriptors he previously assigned to her. A strategic asset, a prize. He desires her, the oppositional, spirited subject who challenges him, who claims his space as her own, and who exhibits a courage he states his own subordinates lack. As a lacrimal response traces paths on her cheeks, she perceives the vast gap between his current statements and his past actions. Conceding his errors and his lack of any claim to her, he makes a primal appeal for one chance to be something other than the cold figure she was coerced to marry. His appeal for an opportunity to be authentic compels her to weigh 3 months of profound isolation against this contradictory new information. Bruno's cryptic warning resonates in her memory, alongside the recent trauma of his panic and his extreme protective measures following the attack. Applying the heuristic to trust behaviors over words, she observes a sliver of hope in his expression as she begins to outline her terms. Her primary stipulation is the cessation of all secrecy. His world must become transparent to her, granting her full intelligence on their adversaries as his equal, not his possession. She demands inclusion in strategic decisions and, as a final condition, requires absolute, unfiltered honesty without omissions for her protection. He concedes but adds a reciprocal term. She must offer him the same unmitigated truth. He applies pressure to her hand, compelling her to articulate her needs and his failings. He inquires, his voice strained, if their beginning is something she can ever forgive. She scrutinizes his features for any indication of subterfuge, but finds only raw vulnerability. Acknowledging he has ceded all power to her, she quietly introduces another memory from their wedding day he may have overlooked. Reacting to his look of confusion, she relates Dario's query about whether he would merely enact a role on their wedding night. She repeats his terse reply that he would fulfill his obligation. The memory visibly impacts him, but before he can formulate a response, she lifts a hand to his face in a gesture signaling a new paradigm. As her palm makes contact with his cheek, she presents her analysis. His emotional coldness that night was a construct, a deception directed at his men and himself. She tells him his touch had not been detached or obligatory, but was saturated with a painful, immense restraint. His eyes dilate as they achieve a moment of shared insight. His voice is rough as he discloses his fear was of being consumed by a desire she could then weaponize. She dismisses the idea of leverage, closing the remaining distance between them. Her sole objective, she states, is mutual transparency, not a contest for dominance. She then offers her own disclosure. For 3 months, she had actively attempted to cultivate contempt for him, misdiagnosing her own severe loneliness as relief. She confesses to observing his clandestine glances, a revelation that visibly surprises him. She saw all of it, she asserts, maintaining his gaze with a new conviction. She enumerates the subtle indicators of his covert care. Her preferred wine consistently stocked, her rooms maintained at an optimal temperature, a private box at an opera he ostensibly abhorred. He confirms his aversion to opera, but admits that witnessing her pleasure served as a palliative for his own silent distress. In the charged stillness between them, she dictates the terms of their new agreement, a forward trajectory only, with no defensive emotional posturing. He accepts without pause, sealing the contract with a kiss entirely dissimilar to their first cold transaction, signaling the genesis of their new dynamic. This physical contact represents the release of 3 months of repressed desire and desperation. He interacts with her with a reverence for something invaluable, yet his touch conveys a lifetime of deprivation. She matches his intensity, her hands drawing him nearer, reciprocating the unvoiced need completely. He lifts her into his arms, his grip absolute, the physical act ratifying their armistice. Disengaging for oxygen, he admits to feeling inadequate, but vows to spend his life earning the status of her husband. Her simple, earnest acceptance validates his pledge. She cautions that she is not a subject of low complexity, a statement he greets with a genuine smile, conceding he is not either. The word together becomes their new operational pact. With their internal conflict concluded, she shifts her attention to the external threat, and his entire demeanor hardens in reaction, the predatory aspect of his personality activated. Focused on retribution against those who had violated his domain. Yet his hand sought hers, their digits interlacing as evidence of this nascent, fragile intimacy. He declared the night would be an expression of his passion, a promise that induced a tremor throughout her body. That commitment extended to all subsequent nights. The conflict with the Santoros was a violent 7-day event that remapped the city's criminal topography. From a position of protected isolation, she observed the violent outcomes on the news, a witness to his brutal dominion. Each evening he came back, marked by combat and fatigue, revealing new facets of his persona: the strategist, the commander, the ruthless protector. Within this crucible of violence and intimacy, he finally disclosed the devastating betrayal. The informant was Dario. As she tended to his wounds on the 4th night, he detailed the treachery in a voice devoid of affect. Dario, he explained, was the individual who compromised her location. The familial bond rendered the deception pathological, and his reference to Bruno was an implicit sentence of death. She was processing that some information carries an excessive cognitive load. And the Santoros? She redirected, focusing on his injury. A situation that should have been resolved years prior. His unengaged hand gently cupped her jaw. I am going to eradicate them, utterly. The woman she once was would have recoiled from his words, but she had now processed the sound of gunfire. She had experienced the primal terror of being prey. She had learned that in their ecosystem, mercy is a liability that breeds further conflict and endangers all she valued. Execute your plan, she said quietly. Just return to me. His expression softened. Always. And he did. On some nights, he woke her with the most minimal of kisses. The subject exhibited hypervigilance, often awaiting his return. Their physical intimacy was a frenetic trauma bond forged by constant threat. Post-coitus, he disclosed formative traumas of paternal cruelty and emotional neglect. He recounted his first homicide at 17 as a psyche-altering event. In the profound isolation of his status, he professed trust solely in her. She reciprocated with disclosures of her own maternal abandonment. The subject verbalized escapist fantasies involving art in Florence and articulated a fear of objectification. He countered with narcissistic validation, praising her fire. On the 7th day, an associate arrived with pertinent news. The associate, Bruno, confirmed the elimination of Antonio Santoro's family. The subject observed no remorse in Elio, only cold victory. He then confirmed another target, Dario, was neutralized, asserting Ginevra's full awareness. Elio's statement was final. She knew everything. Bruno displayed approval, noting the operation's success and enhanced power. The subject Ginevra, however, immediately questioned the human cost of the conflict. Bruno quantified the casualties at 37 enemy dead and 3 friendly fatalities. The subject fixated on the collateral damage to their own organization, which prompted a compulsion to visit the families of the deceased. The demand to see the bereaved families was a significant breach of protocol. Bruno outlined the standard procedure of monetary compensation. She rejected this custom, reiterating her demand while Elio remained a silent observer. When questioned, she cited a perceived duty to those who died protecting her. He warned of potential hostility, which she accepted as her due. She dismissed financial restitution as an inadequate response to the loss. Her resolve elicited a display of intense pride from Elio, who agreed to accompany her. The visits were psychologically traumatic. She performed consoling rituals, vowing their sacrifices would be formally recognized. Elio maintained a silent, supportive presence throughout. The subject perceived a shift in the men's affect from deference to genuine loyalty. He later conceded the correctness of her decision, which she acknowledged. Exhibiting profound exhaustion, she sought physical comfort and noted the event's horror. He offered a rationalization about sacrifice. He then declared the threat neutralized, reframing their residence as a secure home. The subject then issued a condition: the dissolution of separate living spaces into a single shared territory. He recoiled at this boundary violation until she reframed it as the co-creation of a new, neutral space. He proposed the estate's disused south wing. Agreeing, she sealed the new arrangement with a kiss. That evening, this section, with its warmer aesthetic, became the new focal point of their shared existence. The space was distinguished by ornate historical features. Elio identified it as his grandmother's former rooms, sealed off after her death when he was 12 due to his father's unprocessed grief. The subject found it had a unique soul. The wing felt curated for living, not for presentation. She prompted him for details. He described his grandmother as his father's only source of positive affect, whose death triggered his own harsh conditioning. The subject voiced her insecurity about gaining this deceased matriarch's approval. He reassured her, stating she embodied an ideal his grandmother had described. She expressed self-doubt, which he immediately refuted. He gestured toward her heart, identifying the locus of her gentleness. For 2 weeks, they engaged in joint domestic and security projects, a novel experience which included minor conflicts and continued physical intimacy. This period of intense, atypical domesticity was highly valued by the subject. He announced the delivery of their bed, prompting her to express relief and contentment with their new cohabitation. He made a sexual overture involving his former room. She declined, citing a preference for their new shared space. He responded with a grandiose declaration that all his assets were now theirs. He enumerated his empire, which she verbally rejected. He interpreted this rejection as proof of her worthiness to receive it. He then outlined a succession plan, naming her his primary heir, a possibility she denied. He insisted on the reality of their dangerous lifestyle, framing his actions as a necessary provision for her future security. The subject experienced this topic as a source of acute somatic distress. Asserting his pragmatism, he informed her of a non-negotiable legal action, moving all assets into joint ownership under her complete control. His tone was firm, precluding any form of negotiation on her part. His justification was her status as an equal. This action was unprecedented in their subculture, leaving the subject stunned. He dismissed her gratitude, framing the transfer of power as her inherent right. He sealed the promise with a kiss, followed by sexual intercourse. Afterward, she experienced a novel emotional state within the marriage, an effective response she identified as profound happiness. She then made an involuntary confession of love, a development consistent with trauma bonding. After an initial moment of rigidity, he responded with an intense embrace and a reciprocal, aggrandized confession. He claimed her influence had overcome his emotional inhibitions, professing love for her defiant spirit. He identified her as the nexus of an internal conflict between his sociopathy and a nascent moral compass. The subject demonstrated full acceptance of his pathological traits as part of his identity. A brief period of unguarded rapport followed, yet this peace was merely a temporary cessation of hostilities. 60 days later, a physiological event occurred. Elio noted her recurring morning emesis. The subject's own physical state confirmed a single, terrifying, and unwanted biological probability. A brief calculation indicated a gestation period of 6 to 7 weeks. Her verbal denial was undermined by somatic indicators of anxiety. He immediately appeared and challenged the transparent deception. His intense observation was paired with an appraisal of her poor lying skills, delivered with a new term of endearment. This intimacy heightened her distress, making their newfound stability feel acutely threatened. The subject's routine had stabilized into a cadence of domestic rituals and physical intimacy. The female, Geneva, demonstrated a clear resistance to allowing a biological variable to disrupt this equilibrium. A charity board meeting is scheduled, she deflected. The fundraiser is Geneva. He traversed the space, manipulating her face to enforce eye contact. Report the anomaly. Compelled by their protocol of honesty, she offered the unmitigated data. A pregnancy is a distinct possibility. The statement introduced a variable of immense gravity. Elio's facial expression became a neutral mask. His posture registered immediate tension. The resulting silence was a corrosive agent, degrading her optimistic prognosis. The 60-day duration of their bond was insufficient for this development. Pregnant, he finally processed, his vocalization low, as his hand shifted from her jaw to her abdomen. Our progeny, she posited with caution. Perhaps. A test is required. His tone acquired a harsh, urgent quality. Administer it. Now. Elio, I request. Geneva, I require confirmation. A momentary lapse in his affective control, a brief signal of profound vulnerability, secured her compliance. Acknowledged. The subordinate Bruno was dispatched, procuring a selection of test kits with an impassive demeanor. She secured the laboratory, leaving Elio to pace the bedroom with the agitation of a caged predator. 3 diagnostic tools from discrete manufacturers were arranged on the marble surface. The interval was marked by acute psychological distress. Each device rendered an identical conclusion, a trio of positive indicators. Upon opening the door, she met Elio's gaze as he ceased all motion. Her slow, deliberate nod served as the primary data transfer. I am pregnant. He crossed the room and initiated a rapturous spinning motion. His laughter was an acoustic event of pure elation she had not previously documented. We are producing an heir, he announced, his awe palpable. A positive outcome, Geneva. A wave of somatic relief washed over her. You are pleased. Pleased? He repeated, his expression energized. I am horrified and thrilled. But yes, amore, I am pleased. For a period of weeks, the intelligence remained a classified secret between the two subjects. Elio's surveillance intensified, his protective programming entering an elevated state. Security personnel were doubled, then tripled. A nutritionist began regulating her diet, while Dr. Caesar, the family physician, initiated weekly medical evaluations. Your behavior is inducing psychological strain, she communicated to him one evening. I am ensuring your security, he countered. Both of you. But their closed system was facing an external breach. 3 weeks later, Bruno appeared, his expression grim. We have a developing situation, he reported, placing a file on Elio's desk. Marcus Vitali is initiating hostile action. The name was familiar, a rival alpha with significant ambition. Specify the nature of the action? Elio demanded, his grip on her tightening protectively. He is engaging with allied families, suggesting a degradation of your operational effectiveness. Bruno's gaze shifted to her, conveying a nonverbal apology. The hypothesis is this union has rendered you a liability. Allow me to extrapolate, Elio stated with dry contempt. He is positioning himself as the superior leader. Correct, Bruno confirmed, presenting photographic intelligence. He is also targeting your assets, proposing improved terms. Some of the individuals in the images were known to her. Have there been any defections? Negative at present. A dark cast settled on Bruno's features. But the subject is persistent, exploiting historical loyalties. He targets operatives who believe your domestic focus has superseded your professional duties. The indirect insult registered. Elio's hand located hers. Their assessment is flawed, he stated quietly. Our enterprise has never been more profitable. Our control is absolute. I am aware, boss, but Vitali is adept at narrative manipulation. Bruno paused. There is an additional intelligence item. Present it. He is aware of the child. A visceral coldness infiltrated her system. How? The source of the leak is unconfirmed. A mole is possible. Or a data breach from Dr. Caesar's facility. He is circulating rumors concerning the Vieira line, alluding to the strategic benefit of an accident pre-partum. Elio's expression hardened into granite. He threatened my family. He is too strategic for a direct threat, Bruno clarified. Yet the implication was clear. The man she loved was subsumed by the cold strategist persona. His face was pure steel. He delivered his orders with lethal calm. Arrange a summit. All family heads tomorrow. Inform Vitali. His attendance is mandatory. After Bruno's departure, Elio's rigid exterior fractured as he initiated physical contact. He made a low-level vocalization, an oath. He will not make contact. No entity will ever harm you or this child. She clung to him, her own cognitive processes accelerating. Vitali was employing a provocation strategy. When my family is threatened, no response is excessive. But she advocated for strategy over pure aggression. Do not provide him the desired outcome. Demonstrate this union made you a superior force, not a target. He observed her, stunned. When did you develop such tactical thinking? I integrated with the kingpin, she said. I had to learn the protocols. The heads of the families were assembled at a neutral site downtown. Protocol dictated her exclusion based on gender. She refused to comply. If their claim is that I am the locus of your weakness, she argued, subverting the patriarchal system, then it is imperative they observe me as a strategic asset, not a liability. Elio exhibited signs of internal conflict, his protective mandate warring with her flawless logic. Agreed, he conceded. You will remain at my side, but Vitali is my target. Understood, she murmured. My sole function is to project disapproval. His laugh was strained. In that attire, your effect is significantly more than intimidating. Her wardrobe was a calculated tactic. A black gown radiated authority. A ruby necklace from her matriarchal line. Her hair was styled with precision. She embodied the Mafia matriarch archetype as they made their entrance. 5 men, apex predators, performed an instant visual assessment upon their entry. Marcus Vitali was younger than her projection, perhaps mid-40s, with a rehearsed smile. He rose as they approached, offering Elio a hand in a hollow gesture of respect. Vieira, your summons was timely, and Mrs. Vieira, his gaze conducted an insolent scan, you appear radiant. The marital state is beneficial, she replied, her tone glacial, her hand placed deliberately on her abdomen. It was a calculated public declaration. She observed calculation flicker in Vitali's eyes, then dismissal. He had misdiagnosed her as a vulnerability. The man was a fool. Elio escorted her to the head of the table, placing her at his right. Gentlemen, I value your presence. I am aware of certain discussions regarding my affairs. It is time for a clarification. I have no conflicts, Giovanni Russo, the eldest, declared. Your profit margins are self-evident. Leo Carbone signaled his assent. Vitali offered a taut smile. The financials are robust. Elio always had a talent for figures. My concern, however, is a matter of principle. Elio's vocal tone lowered, each word a veiled threat. Elucidate for us, Vitali began. Our profession requires a specific type of man, unforgiving, with total focus. His eyes moved to her. Some might be concerned that this level of comfort dilutes that necessary cruelty. Some might, Elio agreed, his calm a chilling signal. Does this concern you, Marcus? The use of his first name was a deliberate status insult. A muscle in Vitali's jaw spasmed. My concern is for our collective security, he countered, his delivery smooth. A weakness in one family makes us all exposed. A cold sound escaped Elio's throat. Permit me to offer my analysis of this union, Marcus. I perceive a partner who has refined my ambition and clarified my vision. I perceive a woman with a primal grasp of our environment. I perceive the mother of my heir who will inherit an empire far larger than mine. He stood, his presence dominating the room. You wish to analyze weakness? Let us analyze your own. Your standing has been eroding for a year. Your men are disloyal. They obey out of fear. Your desperation is so acute you aim your coded insults at my pregnant wife. Blood flooded Vitali's face. I would never. You did. Elio's statement was a clinical incision, silencing the denial by confirming a shared reality. The remaining variable was the consequence. A dense silence descended. The men were inert, awaiting the sentence. You have two options, Marcus, Elio announced. Beg my wife's pardon, pledge fealty to my family, and cede significant territory, or refuse, and we will resolve this according to ancestral protocol. The ultimatum was presented. Vitali's eyes scanned the room, searching for an ally. He found only impassive neutrality. His support base had disintegrated. Survival required submission. I meant no offense to Mrs. Vieira, he finally forced out, each word a cost to his ego. Or to your heir. The words were a concession, not a true apology. His hands clenched on the table. I regret that my meaning was misinterpreted. It was a minor concession. Elio resumed his seat, his hand covering hers. Bruno will contact you tomorrow regarding the transfer. This meeting is concluded. But she should have perceived the deception. She should have known a subject like Marcus Vitali would not metabolize such a public humiliation and simply withdraw. 2 weeks later, her 6-month pregnancy was visually obvious. Elio's drive to protect her became a constant, a compulsion for proximity. But the charity gala she had organized was tonight, and she refused to allow fear to induce a state of confinement. I will have 10 guards, she assured him, and Bruno is my personal driver. It is a museum, Elio, not a militarized zone. All territory is contested, he countered, his tone grim as he secured her necklace. But you are correct. I cannot sequester you. You could attempt it, she challenged with levity, rising to kiss him. But my resistance would make your life untenable. It already is, he replied, a slight smile forming. Report your arrival, your departure, and at 60-minute intervals. The gala was an exhibition of affluence, the museum transformed by flora and sculpted illumination. She moved through Chicago's elite, her status as Elio's spouse now largely accepted. She discussed art and philanthropy while her security detail maintained a covert perimeter. Deep in a dialogue about a new scholarship, Bruno materialized beside her, his expression ashen. Mrs. Vieira, we must evacuate immediately. The unmitigated dread in his voice was a systemic shock. What is the situation? The dawn, a critical incident occurred. Her perception of reality destabilized. Clarify the nature of the incident. Not in this location. Bruno's hand guided her with authority toward the exit. I will brief you in the vehicle. The transit home was the most protracted, agonizing interval of her existence. Bruno's debriefing was concise and professional, yet his words constructed a traumatic narrative. Vitali had not submitted. He had orchestrated a far larger operation, an attempt to assassinate Elio, and usurp control of the entire Vieira syndicate. He fabricated a negotiation regarding territory transfer and ambushed Elio with over a dozen assailants. What is his condition? She whispered, her hands reflexively moving to her abdomen. "He is viable," Bruno stated, a declaration offering no reassurance. "Dr. Caesar is attending to him." The residence was a state of disciplined chaos. Armed men secured every entrance. The domestic staff moved like phantoms with expressions of terror. She proceeded rapidly down the corridor, drawn by the sound of urgent colloquy from their suite. Elio was positioned near her bed, his shirt sheared away, as Dr. Caesar worked urgently on his shoulder. The volume of blood was extreme, saturating the linens and coating the physician's gloves. "Elio!" She vocalized his name in a choked sob. His eyes opened, fixating on hers. "Jane, your presence is expected at the gala, and you are not expected to sustain a gunshot wound," she retorted, closing the distance. Her hands displayed tremors as she took his, feeling the thermal output of his own blood. "Who is responsible?" "Vitali," he ejected the name like poison. "The subject had 12 operatives. My team was only 4. "His present whereabouts?" she demanded of Bruno. "He has gone deep undercover," Bruno confirmed, his tone grave. "But the search protocol is already active." The doctor intervened. "Mrs. Vieira, I require operational space." "I will not leave his position." "Geneva." Elio attempted to sit up, but a spasm of pain arrested the motion. "The fetus is unharmed," she reported tersely. "You are not." "What is the diagnosis, doctor?" "The projectile passed through cleanly," Dr. Caesar announced, resuming his task. "No major vascular damage. He requires rest and antibiotics, but the prognosis is survival." The ensuing relief nearly caused a loss of her motor control. "Thank God. Credit not a deity," Elio amended, his voice strained with pain but stable. "Credit Bruno. His driving was that of a madman to secure my extraction." As time progressed, the complete narrative emerged. Vitali's ambush was strategically flawless, but he had miscalculated Elio's will to survive and Bruno's combat expertise. They had fought their way to extraction, but Elio sustained a bullet wound during the engagement. Vitali and his primary cell had disappeared completely. Every known associate, safe location, and legitimate enterprise was vacant. "He is entirely off-network," Bruno reported to her that night while Elio was medicated. "But evasion is futile. The directive is out. Every organization, every asset knows Marcus Vitali is a marked man." She maintained a vigil at Elio's bedside, monitoring his respiration. The initial terror of witnessing his injury had transformed into a cold, sharp resolve. "I demand to be involved in locating him," she stated, her voice low but resolute. Bruno's expression was severe. "Mrs. Vieira, your husband would not forgive my allowing you to enter a hostile environment." She met his gaze without wavering. With Elio incapacitated, a new command structure was necessary. As he began to protest, citing her condition, she interrupted him. She was the Don's wife, which now made her the de facto authority. Turning to the window, she issued her first directive. "Assemble the lieutenants here tomorrow morning." These men were about to discover the true nature of their leader's spouse. She noted the doubt in Bruno's gaze, but also a nascent respect. He agreed to arrange the meeting. The next day, 10 of Elio's senior captains gathered. As she entered, their collective disbelief was a palpable force in the room. A pregnant woman assuming a command role. "Gentlemen," she began, assuming Elio's seat at the head of the conference table. "You are aware my husband is in recovery. Until he is fully operational, I will be directing the search for Marcus Vitali." One of them, likely Tony, interjected. With all due respect, Mrs. Vieira, this is a masculine domain. This is a family operation, she corrected him, and I am the family. Bruno, provide a status report on Vitali's last known coordinates. For the following hour, she methodically deconstructed every intelligence file, his network, his assets, his behavioral patterns. She posed a battery of questions, searching for any exploitable weakness. She observed their skepticism slowly transition into a reluctant deference. He has a sister, she vocalized her thought process. Unmarried, resides alone in Lincoln Park. Any recent communication? Bruno verified the location was under surveillance but was inactive. He would not risk direct contact, she theorized. It is too exposed. He would transmit a message via a courier, a trusted intermediary. Her gaze locked onto Tony. You were raised in that area. Who is her confidant? His eyes widened in recognition. Her parish priest, Father Donovan at St. Mary's. Deploy a team to that church, she commanded. I require them to be completely covert. If a communication is passed through that priest, we intercept it. Bruno nodded, visibly impressed. A sound strategy. She was correct. 2 days later, the surveillance team observed the sister receiving a call at the church before departing hastily with luggage. The team tracked her to a remote cabin 2 hours to the north, where they located a concealed Marcus Vitali. Elio was still convalescing when Bruno's team returned with a restrained and injured Vitali. She was in the study reviewing security protocols when they entered. Mrs. Vieira, Bruno announced. We have the asset. What is your directive? She understood this moment was a test, a trial of her psychological fortitude. They needed to observe her resolve before the next phase. Her focus settled on Vitali, the agent of her husband's potential demise. There was no emotional response, only a frigid, tactical clarity. To the wine cellar, her voice was emotionless. Confine him. I will inform my husband that he has a visitor. She found Elio elevated by pillows, his vitality returning, though his movements remained measured. You have been administering affairs, he observed, his gaze on some paperwork covering the bed. The organization required leadership. She sat on the bed's periphery. Vitali is in custody. His eyes narrowed, his predatory focus rekindling. Location. She then detailed the events of her quiet takeover. She narrated the deductive process that led to Vitali and how his subordinates' attitudes had shifted from scorn to respect. You accomplished this, he said, his tone containing pure astonishment. You located him. You commanded my personnel. Geneva, you were an elemental force. I experienced fear, she conceded, but the rage was a stronger impetus. He attempted to eliminate you and our offspring. I would not permit it. His fingers traced the contour of her jaw, his look one of absolute reverence. What is his disposition? The decision was being delegated to her. Her husband was yielding the authority to determine Marcus Vitali's fate. You will oversee it, she responded, but I will be present. He must witness that the woman he appraised as a liability was the very agent of his downfall. A potent pride flared in Elio's expression. Tomorrow, at twilight, when my strength is greater. Later, in the stillness of their room, his hand rested flat on her abdomen. An abrupt, forceful movement from within caused them both to laugh with surprise. A combatant, Elio murmured near her ear, like its mother, or its father, she countered quietly. A reflection of his father, the progeny would be heir to a power structure. A kiss in the dimness sealed their covenant of affection and succession. The subsequent evening, this duality was presented before a kneeling Marcus Vitali. Elio's voice was a low, fatal instrument. "You assessed my wife as a weakness," he stated. "A critical miscalculation. She is my fortress, Vitali. She is my stability, the rationale for my constructive, rather than purely destructive, impulses." Vitali's retort was unadulterated disdain. "She is merely a female." No. She stepped into the illumination, her hand defensively over her abdomen. "I am the female who engineered your capture, who co-opted the men you believed were loyal, and who carries the next heir to the Vieira dynasty." Her gaze met Elio's. "My function in this is complete. Execute what is required." They rose from the cellar together, his hand a steadying pressure on her back, leaving Bruno to the grim task that remained. The details were of no consequence. All that was significant was the neutralization of the threat and the security of her family unit. 3 months later, in the severe cold of a December evening, the subject underwent the trauma of childbirth. Elio, an individual conditioned by violence, displayed a complete loss of composure, fractured by a stimulus beyond his control. His verbal affirmations of her strength were a transparent mask for his own fear. Her response was a clipped observation on the passivity of his role. "You are not the one being torn apart," she articulated before pain superseded coherent speech, yielding to Dr. Caesar's instructions. A final vocalization of both agony and triumph announced the birth. "A daughter," Dr. Caesar stated, initiating maternal-infant bonding. The neonate's physical characteristics were a direct replication of Elio's. The narrative shifts to the birth of an infant. The subject observes. The neonate possesses the father's distinctive gray eyes. All vital signs appear normal. The subject vocalizes affection, while Elio exhibits a rare, positive emotional display, assessing the infant as perfect. "You are both perfect. What will we call her?" she inquired, focusing on him. "Elena," he responded instantly, linking the name to a grandmother who reconciled power with empathy. "Elena Vieira," she repeated, processing the name. The infant became quiescent, its gaze fixed upon them in what they perceived as acknowledgement. "She is already judging us," the subject stated, an emotional release, mixing lacrimation with laughter. "An observant child," Elio remarked, reinforcing the mother-child identification. Later, with the infant asleep on her, she began a cognitive review of the violent trajectory that had paradoxically led to this moment of profound calm. She traced the relational arc, the initial animosity, the trauma bonding through bloodshed, the union solidified by conflict with the rival Vitali. Elena represented the physical manifestation of their shared history. She then initiated a verbal examination of their relationship's origin, asking, "Do you remember what you said on our wedding day? That I was merely a business arrangement?" His physical hold tightened, a nonverbal display of regret. "The biggest lie I ever told," he stated. "Mine as well," she admitted, because I accepted it as truth. Her role had been internalized as a functional obligation devoid of intrinsic worth. And now he began redirecting her focus. "Now I understand," she stated. "You kept your distance to defend yourself from needing me. I frightened you." "You still do," he conceded. "The hold you have on me is a terrifying power." "Good," she replied, reinforcing the dynamic with a kiss. "Because you terrify me as well." This shared reality was now fully integrated. When Elena stirred, Elio credited the infant with their salvation. He then transferred the credit to his partner, stating she provided motivation for his behavioral modification. "We saved each other," she corrected, defining this as a primary function of their family system. This exchange triggered her realization that she had spent her life attempting to escape the type of power structure she now commanded. She had previously defined freedom as withdrawal from chaos. The core paradox she now understood was that true agency came from securing a position within the chaos alongside a partner who amplified her dominant traits. Her initial assessment of him as a predatory figure was fundamentally revised. She concluded that such monsters are individuals who lacked a stimulus for moral development. Their dynamic became symbiotic. She acted as the catalyst for his humanization, while he, in turn, provided the anchor for her own autonomy.